join us a little late, but we'll go ahead and get started for the time being. My name is Robert Moore. I'm an attorney with the OSU Agricultural and Resource Law Program, and I'd like to welcome you to our H-2A webinar. My role is to do some quick introductions and then turn it over to our expert speakers. Our speakers today are Margaret Jodlowski, from the assistant professor with the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. Jeff Lewis, attorney with the OSU Agricultural and Resource Law Program. Then we have Daniel Caldron and Steve Banig with the Department of Labor. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves a bit further when their sessions come up. Just quickly, why are we having this webinar? About a year ago, the Ohio Corn and Wheat Growers had a meeting that where they invited OSU Extension people to meet with their board of directors, and Margaret and I were at that meeting. And as we met with the board members, almost every time their number one concern was labor, that they have a labor shortage and they just can't find people to work on their farms, and it's causing them financial stress and the inability to grow in size. And at the time, my thought was, well, can't really do much about that. Labor is what it is. But then I was talking to a friend of mine who has a grain operation, and he has two H-2A workers from South Africa. And he was telling me how well it's worked out for him, and it's just a great source of labor, and they're so glad they've done it. And that got me thinking of, well, why aren't more traditional farms like grain operations and livestock operations using H-2A? And I think part of the reason is we typically think of the H-2A program as more for fruit, vegetable nurseries, really labor intensive seasonal operations. But Jeff and Margaret and I got together and talked, and we do think H-2A can have a significant role with grain and livestock operations in Ohio. So what we want to do with this webinar and our efforts going into the future is just make sure that more traditional farming operations in Ohio are at least familiar with H-2A, know it may be an option for them, and encourage farming operations to explore H-2A. It's not for everybody, but I think there are many farms in Ohio that may be able to address their labor concerns with the H-2A program. My last kind of announcement before we get started is we are going to record this webinar, and we will post it on our farm office website. However, due to Department of Labor rules, regulations, request, we will not be recording Danielle and Steve's session. So if you're looking at this as a recording, their presentation will not be on. We apologize for that, but that's just Department of Labor rules. If you have questions, put your questions in the chat box or the question and answer box. I will keep an eye on those. And if we do get a question, I'll jump in and ask our speaker to address that. So we would like audience participation. Please ask questions. All of our speakers have a lot of expertise, so now's the time to learn about the H-2A program. Okay, with that, let's get started. Margaret, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. And it is a real pleasure to be here. Go ahead and share my screen. Hope that worked. Yes?
You're all good?
Yes.
Excellent. So As Robert said, my name is Dr. Margaret Jadlowski. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics here at The Ohio State University. My research focuses mainly on agricultural labor. I also do a little bit related to risk management and a little bit on land markets as well. And what we are here to talk about today is the role of H-2A in the agricultural labor landscape. So what I'll be doing first is providing a little bit of background on the agricultural labor market in general to kind of give us all a sense of where H-2A fits in, the issues related to labor that H-2A might be able to solve, and how it compares in terms of program utilization. After that, I'll do a brief overview of the program. We have some people here who are definitely much more in the weeds on program operations, so I won't spend too much time there, but this will just be a sort of high level overview for those of you who have never heard of the program or are really unfamiliar. And then I will spend hopefully the majority of the time talking about actual data on H-2A usage in Ohio. So looking at how it has trended over time, how wages are changing over time, and most importantly, I think for this group and for the purpose that Robert so effectively motivated, looking at how utilization of the program has changed in terms of operations that are only bringing in a very small number of workers. So thinking about, instead of thinking about the program, as Robert said, as something that's targeted only at, very labor intensive operations who are bringing in hundreds of workers, looking at the extent to which we're seeing applications for just one or two workers on an operation, which, although we can't perfectly say that those are row crop farms or less labor intensive operations, it's a pretty good indication. So that is where we will be going today. Just to center all of us on some ground truths here, I always like to start with a high level introduction, and I think I have this bullet point on every single one of my slides. And this is just something, if you're an agricultural operator yourself or you work in the industry, you know to be true. Labor is a huge pressure point. There is a pretty significant gap between the labor that operations are demanding and the labor that is being supplied. It's always rather difficult for operators to find the right people at the right time for the right price, for the right wage. And this is something that has been pervasive. There's a sense that it's getting worse, but it is an issue that has been longstanding in the industry. And so labor is always a challenge. Automation often gets tossed around as maybe, oh, I thought robots did all that work now anyway. I thought the tractors drive themselves. Those are kind of common refrains that you hear if you work in this space. But the reality is that it is not perfect and it's also not universal. So the equipment that's required is quite costly. It's cost prohibitive in some cases. It can't do everything. Um, and so there is still really significant labor needs. And this is true even for the kinds of operations that Robert was talking about at the start. Our row crop operations, yes, are less labor intensive, but they are not entirely labor free. Agriculture is still very much a human enterprise across the state, regardless of operation type. So the idea of automation as a silver bullet, it really, leaves much to be desired. And so what ends up happening is that more and more we are seeing visa workers, especially H-2A visa workers, which is the focus of today's webinar, fill the gap between that labor demand on one side and the labor that is available on the other. And so what we will talk about today, as I said, really quick, hopefully, overview of the general labor market for agriculture in the state, including a little look at how wages have been trending for different kinds of jobs, and then moving really quickly into that program overview that I mentioned. So high level summary of what the program is and what operators are required to provide. And I'm sure we will get into much more detail on the ins and outs of that as we move on to Jeff and Danielle. But for that I'll do a quick intro for myself. And then, as I said, the highlight for me is really, if you know me at all, you know how much I love working with the data and seeing what that has to tell us. And so we'll get into some trends and some figures on the H-2A program in Ohio in particular. So without further ado, let's talk about the current state of the agricultural labor market. I think it's important, first and foremost, when we're talking about agricultural labor, we'll start nationwide and then drill down into Ohio in just a little bit. The reality is that, as we know, a good proportion of the labor force does lack legal documentation to work in the state, or sorry, in the country, and that proportion has remained relatively stable if we look over time. These are data from the National Agricultural Workforce Survey, or NAWS. And if we look over time, the green bar is the proportion that are undocumented, and it's been trending right around 40% pretty much since the start of the century, right around 2000. It's sometimes in some years slightly less than 40%, some years slightly more, but typically that 40% mark is what we consider. So the share of workers that lack documentation hasn't grown significantly. It also hasn't shrunk significantly either. So domestic workers are not, flocking to the industry and driving these workers out. And also these workers' legal status is not changing. So they're not, getting some kind of documentation and filling that orange bar, which represents workers who are foreign born but have legal documentation to work in the United States, either through some sort of permanent residency, a visa, or asylum status. And then, of course, in the blue is our share of native born citizens. These are people who are citizens of the US by virtue of being born here, and their share has also, there's some fluctuation seasonally, or some sort of time trend, but it's relatively stable at, again, around 30%, filling in that native born workforce. And so the idea, again, just to sort of center ourselves, that the workforce is overwhelmingly foreign born, maybe not overwhelmingly, it's certainly majority, and then also dispel the notion that all agricultural workers lack legal status is also something of a myth when we look at the actual numbers. What is concerning from a labor demand perspective is what we're showing here on this next slide. So this is going to show the average hours per worker per week by legal status, and that number has been trending up over time, particularly for those undocumented workers. But excuse me, too quick on the trigger there. Particularly for undocumented workers, but really for all of them. We're seeing the number of hours worked per week trend upward over time. And what this tells us is that the amount of workers who are available in the pool has been going down. So we know that the amount of work has not really changed. Instead, we're seeing fewer people in the industry, meaning that those that remain are required to do that much more work per week on average. And of course, this is an average, so subject to outliers. We have workers who are working many more hours than 40 hours a week, but quickly trending towards almost an average of 50 hours a week, which is really quite noticeable for the industry. So really belies the sort of drying up or decline in available workforce for agricultural labor from an agricultural labor perspective. If we look in at Ohio in particular, we have a few different sources of data on agricultural workers. This is going to be data from the BLS Occupational Workforce Survey, and it tells us something that I think all of us know very well, and that is that overall there are relatively few farm workers in Ohio. So the number has, if you squint, I believe that is a slight upward trend, but the number has really not changed all that much, even from 10 years ago, the number has stayed relatively flat at about 3.5 thousand. And so we're not seeing huge growth in the industry, and I don't think that that's a surprise to any of us. When we break down the share of Ohio's agricultural workers by the type of work that they do, we can see something of an interesting trend, particularly for this red bar, which represents equipment operators. So that is, I think, the population that's most relevant to the kinds of operations we're talking about today. These are, our highest skilled agricultural workers, in one sense, and their numbers have been trending up pretty significantly. I think this is sufficient enough to call it a significant upward trend. And I think a lot of that, when we get to the next couple of slides, has to do with the increased wage we're seeing for these workers. So these workers have skills that are easily translatable into other industries, particularly any industry where they're operating heavy equipment, so truck driving and construction. And so we're seeing increased competition for these workers. Increased competition always drives up price, and so they are able to command a higher wage. And there is, at least in the past 2 years, pretty significant evidence that this population is responding to that increased incentive to do that work. And so we are seeing a small amount of growth. It's obviously nothing overwhelming, but a small amount of growth in terms of equipment operators. And it's important to note that in these figures, as well as the ones I showed on the other slides from the NAWS, these figures do not include H-2A workers. So these are workers who are not here on temporary visas. They are, in the state on a somewhat permanent basis, because of course we don't know everyone's migrancy status or anything like that, but they are not H-2A workers. We can say that pretty unequivocally. So that just gives a sense of how Ohio's agricultural workforce is broken out. We'll take a quick look at how agricultural wages are trending and then jump into the details of the program, H-2A program, which is why we are all here today. So if we look first nationally, again, we're going to look by legal status, as I think that contains a lot of important variation. What we see, again, if you're a seasoned farm operator, I think this will also not be some huge surprise to you. Wages have been trending up. So this is the real wage in dollars per hour over time since 1990. And of course, what we're seeing, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, is a pretty significant spike in wages, sustained wage growth, particularly for that undocumented group. So in prior years, there had certainly been a gap between their wages and even wages of those who are foreign born but have documentation. That gap has mostly eroded as we move into later years. And the most recent data available shows all of these wages are pretty much now in of the ballpark of each other and right around that $15 an hour mark as well. Oops, excuse me. And so really shows the one of the, I think, acute challenges for farm operators is, of course, the cost of labor. It's not just finding the people, it's also paying them. And so this is certainly something that bears a lot of attention and needs to be kept in mind as we look to rising costs of workers everywhere is something that's going to play a very important role when we look at the cost of participation in the H-2A worker program. When we look at Ohio specific farm wages, again, broken out by job type, we can see that wage growth that I talked about for the equipment operators on the red line, it's moderated somewhat. This was a pretty significant jump from 22 to 23, and it's flatlined a little bit into this year, but really sustained wage growth, much more so than wages for our crop workers and livestock workers. And again, that $15 an hour mark has become, I've said this a few times, but it's the new reference point wage. We don't really need a minimum wage anymore because it seems to be $15 an hour pretty much regardless. I'm being somewhat tongue in cheek there, but it is pretty noticeable how wages seem to be coalescing around that point. And so we also, of course, need to note that skilled worker commanding a higher wage, particularly as competition increases um, for those workers among other industries as well. So that is just all said to give us a picture of where we are at in Ohio in terms of agricultural labor. It's not an industry with a ton of skilled workers. The skilled workers are compensated very well, and they are responding to that somewhat. But of course, there's always need for the right kind of people to do these jobs. And so we turn now to talk about the H-2A program and how it might serve an important role in filling those positions for Ohio's row crop operations in particular. So just as a high level summary, the H-2A program is a visa program. So H-2A is the name of a visa. So workers are here in the country on what is called an H-2A visa. It is particularly designated for work that is directly agricultural. So any kind of food processing or food service or anything like that does not count. It has to be on farm agricultural work, and it also has to be work that is temporary and or seasonal. So workers in the country are legal. That H-2A visa allows them both to be in the country legally and also work in the country, authorizes them to work in the country on the particular agricultural operation or for the farm labor contractor that sponsored them. The visa duration is typically 6 to 9 months. There's the possibility of renewal, but I will let our friends with more details on program function talk about that. As I said, the visa is tied to a specific job slash employer. So there are two routes by which workers come into the U.S. on H-2A visas. Some are hired directly by by a farm operation. Some others are hired by what is called an FLC, or farm labor contractor. And so in that case, the FLC is their employer, and they sort of meet them out to the operations that need them. And so this doesn't allow for people to move from job to job. They're tied to that specific employer as part of the terms of their visa. So the role of FLCs is, I don't know if middleman is a fair term, but it is certainly in some ways certainly appropriate. So they can do a lot of the bureaucratic work around the application process. They can manage the workers if need be, and depending on the kind of operation that you have and your taste for human resources and application processes, it might make sense. I think Jeff and Danielle both have a lot to say about this as well, and so I'll leave it at that, just to say it's an option. It might not be the right option for anyone, and finding one that is trustworthy and that you enjoy working with is somewhat key. And that is because the application can be quite complex. I've often, when speaking to operators who have used the program, heard that it is costly both in terms of time and in terms of money. So there are costs at various stages of the application process that Jeff, I believe, will get into in more detail. So having someone who is knowledgeable about participation, or is indeed doing the application on your behalf as an FLC would, can be beneficial in that way. And as Robert alluded to in his introduction, the workers do come from many countries. There are some countries that are disallowed from participating, but the majority of workers are coming from the same places that our traditional agricultural workforce is coming from. So that is countries like Mexico, the countries of Central America. But as Robert said, an increasing trend is seeing workers, especially those who are, doing those higher skilled jobs and operating equipment, coming from places that are sort of middle income countries, or countries that have been rapidly developing over the last 30 to 40 years, such as South Africa. And so we are seeing an increased presence of these kinds of workers in our H-2A workforce, although it is mostly anecdotal because we lack data to track specifically where people are from. So we know very little about who these people are. I mean, we researchers, other people who are more official certainly know, but from the research perspective, we only hear about this anecdotally and can't provide any strong numbers to corroborate that. But it is certainly something that is being talked about more and more, and they do have increased representation over time, certainly. In terms of what employers are required to do as part of the H-2A program, or as part of having an H-2A visa worker, I think the thing that gets perhaps the most attention is that employers are committing to pay their H-2A workers what is called the adverse effect wage rate, or AWAR. What it is essentially is a minimum wage for H-2A workers, but it is higher than the prevailing minimum wage, and indeed higher than the prevailing farm labor wage in your local area. And that is designed to prevent adverse effects on the local labor market. So the idea is to, in some way, ensure that the program participation is not so attractive that it swamps demand for domestic workers. So if these workers were both a lot cheaper and much more available, obviously they would be more attractive than domestic workers. And so the AWAR is designed to be high enough to preclude that possibility and keep them as sort of last resort when there is no domestic workforce. Of course, we can all understand the frustration with that when it seems like there are no domestic workers, but of course there is a mandate to ensure that local labor markets are not negatively impacted by program participation, and this is the route that has been chosen to ensure that. It is a regional wage, so it differs by state, but often neighboring states will have this similar AWARs, so it certainly functions almost as a regional wage. And then an important caveat is that if you have H-2A workers, domestic workers who are doing the same job as an H-2A worker must also receive the AWAR. And we'll talk specifically in just a slide or two about what the AWAR is in particular. In addition to paying this elevated wage rate, workers are required to be provided with no-cost housing that meets specific safety standards. And I'm sure Danielle and Stephen will have more to say about what those standards might be. The workers must also be provided with transportation that's both to and from their work site, so wherever their housing is to wherever they will be working, and then also to and from their home country, and then also the ability to prepare their own food, so access to a kitchen or provided meals directly. And then, almost goes without saying, but employers are expected to maintain good records and, of course, comply with US labor laws as well. So that is my brief overview on the program. I'm now going to jump into the data on program usage, and then we will turn things over to Jeff, who will talk about the application process in more detail. So as I've sort of alluded to throughout, there's been pretty tremendous growth in H-2A program usage, even in states like Ohio, which is, a somewhat traditional, I have traditional in scare quotes there, corn belt or, row crop intensive state. So this is data on the number of workers certified in Ohio over the last 20 years. And as you can see, it's a pretty precipitous increase in program usage, and really shows no signs of abating either. So the program is becoming more prevalent. It's surprising that it's happening in this state, almost because of what Robert said at the beginning, that the program has traditionally been thought of as, providing workers to do harvest or, work in more labor intensive industries. And while that has typically been true and certainly remains true for the majority of workers, and we are seeing now greater demand in program usage from, you know, operators who maybe are operating a row crop farm or a sort of diversified operation like that, that isn't necessarily all horticultural crops. Just to give us a little sense of scale, however, so if you remember how dramatic the increase in Ohio's H-2A program participation looked, it sort of almost looks like a flat line when we compare to what is happening in our neighbors to the north. So the increase in program use in Michigan uh, dwarf what's been happening in Ohio. Ohio is, of course, much more closely matching the trend in Indiana, which is a relatively more similarly composition state in terms of agricultural production, and then also relatively close to what's going on in Pennsylvania as well. But of course, Michigan, with its heavy representation of stone fruits, orchards, more horticultural crops, um, has been using that program much more intensively overall as well. And so program usage is climbing everywhere, but still, of course, being driven by states that are more labor intensive. Nationally, the number of workers is increasing year over year. Obviously, some weird situations in 2020 due to the pandemic, but really picked up and got right back on trend after that ended. And again, showing very little signs of abatement here. As I mentioned, in terms of wages, what is the AWAR looking like year over year? So the light blue line, apologies if that's difficult to see, reflects the AWAR. The red line is just the reported wage from the data. That's just mostly to validate that things are happening as they should. And of course, the 2025 data is not out yet, so we know what the AWAR is for this year in Ohio. Excuse me. It's just shy of $20 an hour, so 19.57 is the exact total. As I said, it's trending well above, by design, the minimum wage in the state. And if you look, there's certainly a trend change as well. Excuse me. In that growth followed one pattern from 2007 right up until 2019, and then it seems to have increased at an increasing rate since then. And of course, this is a major, I think, challenge for program utilization is this increased wage, but there is a good amount of evidence that workers who come in on the program tend to be high quality. They're staying in the job. And so there is something of a you get what you pay for story here. But of course, any increase in input costs is going to be difficult to bear from an operator perspective. Just to give a little sense of program growth over time. So in 2017, here's how H-2A workers were distributed across Ohio. So obviously, largest shares in the northern part of the state where we have more greenhouse and nursery production, and then a smattering of them throughout the rest of the state. When we look at the most recent data available, still a strong showing from the northern part of the state, but many more counties now have at least one H-2A worker, and indeed the number of H-2A workers has grown really significantly as well. And so we're seeing them more across different parts of the state, with pretty much the exception of Southeast Ohio over here. And workers really are somewhat pervasive in every area of the state. So we have again, evidence that this is a program that is increasingly being utilized by operations that are not traditionally labor intensive productions. So our row crop farms and so on and so forth. So to get into that a little bit in a little bit more detail and then kick things over to Jeff, this handy little graph shows the number of single worker requests, and this is nationwide, not just in Ohio, but it shows the number is trending up. So again, we can't know for certain that an operation that's requesting only one worker is a row crop operation, but it stands to reason that if the demand for labor is that low, it's somewhat more likely. So we're kind of using that as a proxy for row crop or commodity crop operation participation. And that number is trending up. It's not a huge number, but it certainly is something that is becoming increasingly common. Obviously experienced something of a shock during the pandemic, but again, picked up that trend really quickly afterwards. And then just to give a little specific sense of what requests look like in Ohio, so this is 2024 data. This is the distribution of the number of workers certified. So you request a certain number of workers, and you can request, as you can see, in Ohio, there's a pretty significant range in terms of the number requested. Obviously, some operations are requesting huge numbers of workers, but really the majority of requests in Ohio are for a very, very small number. So the median request is less than 10. 16 is the 75th percentile. So 75% of operations are requesting 16 workers or less. And as you can see, the vast majority are requesting much less than that as well. And so it's really not, again, it's not going to be a perfect measure of who from a farm perspective is participating, but if you are a row crop operation that's considering using the program, you're likely in good company. There are many operations throughout the state that are doing it, and indeed many operations nationwide that are only requesting 1 to 2 workers, and then having that worker certified and on their operation for some part of the year. And so a good sign that the program is being, diversified away from its traditional, labor intensive operations, and promising for the future in terms of a potential solution, maybe not a perfect solution, certainly, but a potential solution to labor demand issues that have plagued the industry. I have 2 quick slides on visa workers and other parts of the supply chain. I'll skip those. The headline there is the same throughout. Visa workers are not that prevalent in food processing and food service. So I will jump quickly to my conclusions and then maybe do a few questions or just toss things over to Jeff, depending on what Robert thinks is best. But the overall conclusion that I will take is that the workforce in an industry should mirror that industry. So agriculture is an industry that is very timely. So it depends very much on the timing of different operations and different processes. And ideally, we would have a workforce that mirrors that. H-2A isn't necessarily perfect in that regard, but it does provide stable and reliable individuals who can be on the operation. And of course, economists love talking about incentives and program participation. Incentives have to align for both labor suppliers, so the workers themselves, and also labor demand. And then as we move into talking about challenges with the program, it's important that we recognize there needs to be solutions, policy or political, that benefit both labor supply and labor demand. But a lot of these workers, from what we know, have been in this program for a very long time and are really quite skilled and really quite willing to contribute to our food and ag industry. And this is not just as harvesters. This is people who are, able to operate equipment and should be, I think, rewarded with increased participation in the program and really serve an important role for our state and really around the country as well. So I've talked for quite a long time. I'm very happy to take questions now, or if you have a particular question you'd like to ask me later, my contact information is right here. I'll let Robert dictate if I've used too much time and have no
Well,
questions.
yeah, well, if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat box. I've got kind of a question comment. I
Please.
only really started learning about the H-2A program just relatively recently. And the thing that struck me is I always assumed H-2A labor was low-cost labor. And I was kind of surprised to learn that that is absolutely not the case. Um, do you think is that the biggest impediment maybe that we haven't seen more wider adoption of H2A? Do you think it's the application process? Do you have any thoughts or data on what the biggest impediment is?
I would say for a row crop operation, cost would not be the biggest impediment. So if you look at that minimum wage, let me obnoxiously flip through my slides again. The AWAR for Ohio at less than $20 an hour, when we compare that to the average wage of an equipment operator, it is still less than that. Again, these are all averages, so take that with a grain of salt. So from a row crop operation perspective, I don't think it's the cost. I think it is just the novelty of the idea and not knowing, am I going to be able to communicate with this person? Is this person going to have the right skills? Are they going to fit into my operation? Um, I think for some operations, especially those, if you imagine, hiring more than 200 people at $20 an hour, that you're looking at that's a massive operation with a massive wage bill and likely has its own HR department to sort all of that out. So certainly for a smaller operation or a more labor intensive operation that's going to need a lot of workers, cost would, I think, be the number one impediment. And then I think on the row crop side, familiarity is certainly going to be the thing that holds people back because it is a different, different from what's traditionally been done, and so that makes it something of a barrier.
All right, I got another question for you. So my friend that I mentioned had workers from South Africa. One of the reasons is they speak English.
Yes.
What kind of language barriers do we have? Are a lot of workers from Mexico and Central or South America, are they less likely to be English speakers? Um, is that an issue?
I would say it's difficult to generalize. I'd say certainly English would very unlikely to be anyone's first language if they're coming from Mexico or Central America. But given the rapidity of economic development in Central America and in Mexico in particular, um, the country is developing very rapidly. Education has improved really significantly. And so younger workers and H-2A workers do tend to be younger from what we know. Will have, I think, what I would describe as at least basic English. They're not going to be, you know, fluent in any regard, but certainly have at least a few years of English language instruction. Eighth grade completion rates in Mexico are, it's not quite universal, but they are quite high, and English is part of the curriculum there. And so, your mileage may vary, of course. You can't say for sure, but it is something that is something that's less of an issue now than I think with an older workforce or a less educated workforce. But obviously, it's never going to be the same as having someone, as you said, South Africans' native language might be English, or they might have had English language education throughout high school or even
Mhm.
post-secondary school. So
Okay.
good question.
Okay. All right. Well, let's turn it over to Jeff, and
Great.
Jeff will let you take it from here.
All right, just 1 second here. All right. So my name is Jeff Lewis. I am an attorney and legal associate for the OSU Ag and Resource Law Program and income tax schools. In those programs, I obviously focus on tax, and I focus on insurance, business entities, and labor and employment. In my free time on the side, I also own my own law firm, and we do a lot of contract representation, business formation, and compliance. So when I want to talk about the H-2A application process. And when I think of the H-2A program and from a compliance aspect, I think of two big spheres, right? You have the application portion, which is a beast of its own. And then you have the compliance with the H-2A program and the wage rates, the housing standards, and all of those issues in its own sphere. And so what I'm going to be presenting today is assuming a couple things. It's assuming that this is a first-time employer applying for an H-2A visa. It's assuming that if you have a question or an issue about a certain process, that you look it up because there are so many nuances, so many complexities to the application process that I don't have the time to give every explanation possible. If we have a 7-week course, we might be able to hit every point. But just know that this is a very broad overview of the application process from a new employer applying for the program perspective. And so with that, if I can make it work, these are just a few of the federal agencies that you'll be dealing with in the H-2A certification process. You have the Department of Labor, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the Department of State. And some of the key phases / major steps that you want to pay attention to in the certification process is the first step is you're going to be submitting what we call a job order to the local state workforce agency. And after you submit that job order, then you will have to file with the Chicago National Processing Center for labor certification. Then after you file for that, you have to start domestic recruiting for domestic labor. And Margaret mentioned a little bit about it, but the purpose behind the H-2A program and the H-2A laws is, while it is to allow for foreign labor to come in and fill those gaps, it also has a focus on protecting domestic labor. So you'll see a lot of that tied in with the recruitment process when you go for H-2A certification. All right, so after you start recruiting domestic workers, then you have to submit paperwork to the NPC, the National Processing Center, to get your final determination. And that final determination will then allow you to submit a petition to the U.S. Customs and Immigration Services to bring in foreign workers. And then after that, you can start to find and onboard foreign workers, and then your foreign worker has to apply and go through the consular process in their home country. Then you have the travel and arrival of the foreign worker to the work site, and then you have extensions that you can apply for if those are applicable. Again, this is just super high speed, overview of the process. And so a few helpful tools as you go through certification. You have the Foreign Labor Application Gateway, and it's known as FLAG. And that FLAG system allows you to complete the first 2 steps, at least, when it comes to getting your job order and your certification from the Department of Labor. I've listed the USDA. I think they have a really great resource and checklist that you can use as you go through the process if you are doing this yourself. And so I found it very helpful. And it also has other resources like a fee schedule, and it includes additional resources that you should be aware of as well. All right, so step one. Step one of the application process is submitting your job order to the state workforce agency. And you'll see that a job order is also known as ETA 790. They're interchangeable, right? So you'll submit your job order to the SWA that serves the geographic area where the agricultural work will be performed. If you have multiple locations, you'll have to submit multiple job orders. And as Margaret was saying, you're tied to that specific job order, so that's why you would need to submit those multiple orders if you have multiple locations in different states. Now, when you submit that, you can submit it through that flag system, or you can send it by mail and include your email. So I say that mail/email. If you were to submit by mail, I believe the most efficient way for the SWA to contact you in the event of any deficiencies is through email or through the online portal. And as I just said, the SWA will notify you if you have any deficiencies, and you have a certain time period to correct those deficiencies. And so the law is clear on this too, and the suggestion is that you complete the job order 60 to 75 days before the first day of anticipated employment. And that 75 days is the maximum. The law is clear on that if when you apply, this is the max you can apply for. Again, remember, this is for first-time employers. I have not become familiar with returning employers for certification. So once you apply for that, it's not necessarily that you start compiling that information. It's always suggested that you prepare your housing for inspection and you compile the different information needed for the job order, obviously before that 75-day time constraint. And some of the information that you can start to compile, and a lot of this is easy, is your legal business name, your federal ID number, your address, and then you get into the different specifics of the job itself. You'll have, the start date and anticipated end date, the number of workers that you will need, job description, which is a whole presentation in and of itself, and making sure that it's accurate and complete. Your wage offer, which is another presentation. We kind of started talking about it with adverse effect wage rate, and making sure you're complying with those different issues and job classifications. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then you'll have your different minimum job qualifications and requirements, your housing information. So all this stuff can be compiled prior to your initial application date. And that just helps smooth out the process if you have all this information available, and might give you an inkling of what the process looks like. So that's the first filing, application, what have you. So you submit that job order, and then you get, once your job order has been approved, you file the ETA 9142A with the Chicago National Processing Center. This is where you get the labor certification. So when you file that ETA 9142A, make sure to include your approved job order and all the required attachments. Now, this is where I suggest you use that flag system, because you go through step by step and it'll tell you what to attach, what to include, etc. So once you've done that filing, you will get a notice of deficiency or a notice of acceptance. If you get a notice of deficiency, you have 5 business days to respond and correct any deficiencies. Conversely, if you think that there is no deficiency or you disagree with the decision, you can appeal to the department's administrative law judge. If you get a notice of acceptance, which is what we all want, right? You will have specific instructions on how to recruit U.S. workers, as well as direct the state workforce agency to circulate a copy of your job order to other states as potential sources for domestic workers. And it's suggested that you complete this job labor certification filing no later than 45 days before the start of the anticipated work date. Excuse me. So once you filed that ETA 9142A, you're not finished with that step yet. So you have an obligation to start recruiting domestic workers, and you must complete a good faith recruitment of domestic labor before the U.S. Department of Labor and the Chicago NPC will grant you the ability to hire foreign workers. And so what does that include? That includes using newspaper ads. I think it's a little archaic, but the law still mentions newspaper ads for circulating the job. You should contact prior domestic workers from the last year if they were not terminated for cause or they did not abandon the job. And there is a little caveat here too. If you've laid off workers within the last 60 days, I think is the time frame, you are not eligible for H-2A certification, but let's pretend like that's not an issue. Then you have to advertise in neighboring states, and that will also be probably part of the notice of acceptance and the labor certification. And then there will be other steps that you need to take that the SWA may implement for promoting the job domestically. And make sure you comply with those and include things in the job advertisement like your name and location, again, your job duties, the wage offer, which Margaret has already mentioned. If you are going into the H-2A program, you have to offer the same wage to domestic workers as you would foreign workers. And then I'm sure that our friends from the Department of Labor will talk about some of the other guarantees that you have in the H-2A program, like a 75% guarantee of total work days, housing standards, wage rates, all that fun stuff. So you include that in your domestic job advertisement, and you have to maintain a recruitment report that you will submit to the Chicago NPC, which will include each recruitment source that you used, contact for each referral or applicant, and your reasons for not hiring eligible domestic applicants, if there are any, and how and when each was contacted. So in this report, you're essentially saying to Chicago NPC, like, hey, I have tried to recruit domestic workers for a period of time, and I'm not finding any eligible domestic workers. I need eligible foreign workers. So that's when you submit the recruitment report. So make sure you submit that recruitment report no later than 30 days, typically before the work day or the start date of work. When you submit this final determination to the NPC, you want to include that signed recruitment report, a housing certificate if you're providing housing, and proof of workers' compensation. If you get a final determination and it is full certification, that means all the workers you requested and the time period you requested is approved. If you get a partial certification, then that means that fewer workers or there's a reduced period for which you can bring in foreign labor. Again, there is a right to appeal that decision within 7 days. All right, so that is really the first 2 filings that we've completed. And now we need to get into the third filing, the next filing. So that would be your petition to United States Customs and Immigration Services. I think I said that right, or Citizenship and Immigration Services, sorry. Once you get that labor certification from the Chicago NPC, you submit Form I-129 to USCIS. And you'll have 2 copies of the I-129 and the supporting documentation, your certified and approved job order, your certified ETA Form 9142A, and make sure you submit the correct filing fee. Now, my research indicates that if you were a first-time employer, that's around $460, but I've included the fee calculator from USCIS here to make sure that you are compliant with that, because they will not review a petition that does not have the correct fee associated with that. And again, you can submit this form by mail or online through the USCIS website. So then after you petition for bringing in foreign agricultural workers, you have to then recruit those workers, right? And the workers must be from eligible countries. Margaret mentioned that already. And you must have a contract in their native language that includes the start and end dates, work locations, hours, job duties, etc. And so you may be asking yourself, how do I recruit? Well, you can do it yourself through ads, newspapers, whatever means necessary. Or you can already partner with an established foreign recruiting agency that has connections to skilled agricultural labor. Even no matter how you recruit, your workers must then apply for the H-2A visa at the local U.S. Department of State or embassy, and they have to pass an interview, background, and security check. And that's that they apply for the visa there. Sorry, I'm going through this really quickly. I want to give our other colleagues here some more time. So just a brief overview of some of the fees. These are basic fees that you probably will encounter. So you're looking at a very basic application, probably around, what is that, 576, 740, 760, something like that. So nearly $1,000 for a very basic application. And the timeline that you want to start this stuff is 75 days before the work start date. But remember, you can compile most of this information beforehand to make that process even easier for you. And so I want to set the stage for our friends from the Department of Labor as we go through the rest of this presentation. And some of the common challenges you'll face throughout the H-2A program will include tight timelines for filing. As discussed, you have that 75-day maximum, and so you have to keep up to date through that whole process as you go through the certification process. There could be housing inspection delays, so make sure you request a housing inspection from your state workforce agency. And in Ohio, we have the Ohio Department of Health that is responsible for inspecting those housing premises. Make sure you're meeting the wage requirements. So this is the law has written into it a little caveat. So right now, the adverse effect wage rate is the higher of all wages. So you're probably going to use the adverse effect wage rate, but it also has written into it in the event that a state or federal minimum wage law is passed that exceeds that adverse effect wage rate, you have to pay the highest of that rate. So it's amendable in that sense. And then job classification. So there are multiple classifications within the agricultural community. We've already seen the equipment operators versus maybe a hand harvester and the wage rate that those two different jobs will have. So there are some classifications that have a higher minimum adverse effect wage rate than others. So making sure you are classifying the job properly and using the appropriate adverse effect wage rate. Some other common challenges are misunderstanding seasonal or temporary definition. This is very nuanced as well. In a brief nutshell, seasonal means that the employment is tied to a cyclical season and not of the operator's doing, right? So like you have harvest season, you have growing season, like those are cyclical, those are natural seasons. You can't just say it's a seasonal job because 9 out of the 12 months of the year you want to hire somebody. And again, that goes into the temporary definition as well. It can't be long term, and it's not just the position itself. I believe it's the function of the position. Is the function of the position temporary in nature, not a permanent job that needs to be filled temporarily for whatever reason? So it's understanding those seasonal and temporary definitions can be quite challenging as well. Then you have the potential delays due to visa processing for your workers. And then Margaret mentioned a little bit about farm labor contractors and other middlemen. While they are useful and they can be a tool to expedite the process, make it easier for you as a producer, farm labor contractors and other middlemen do not take the burden of compliance away from you. So that is an issue that we run into quite frequently with these issues, is that producers will think, oh, well, I've hired a FLC and I don't have to worry about, complying with the application process or complying with this, that, and the other, or they've got it all taken care of or whatever. The burden is still on the producer, on the employer, to make sure that everything is in compliance with the law. So there is some challenge there. And moving forward, we did last year have a final rule announced by the Biden administration, and that rule is titled Improving Protections for Workers in Temporary Agricultural Employment in the United States. I've listed some of the key provisions, and I am more than happy to go over them if you have questions about them. But just know that these are what some of the key provisions that the Biden rule, the 2024 rule, look to change. And I just briefly glance over that because there have been multiple lawsuits already questioning the validity of the 2024 final rule. And with the administration change and the Trump administration, we now have issuance and guidance from the Department of Labor now that is saying they are no longer going to enforce the 2024 rule. And so that kind of bleeds into the future of H-2A. And you'll see the second point there. The Department of Labor has actually proposed a rule that will rescind the final 2024 rule. And I believe the comment period for that rule just ended September 2nd. And some other rumblings or rumors or gossip of future of H-2A, there is potentially a new methodology that the Trump administration will use and propose for calculating the adverse effect wage rate. We've seen an increase in the adverse effect wage rate over recent years, and looking to reduce that burden on agricultural employers has been a talking point for the Trump administration. And then there has been some national legislation reintroduced to Congress, and that is some bipartisan legislation known as the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It has been introduced and failed twice in the Senate previous to this year. And essentially what that legislation does or seeks to do is provide a pathway to legal status for experienced farm workers, and also expand the H-2A program to a year-round labor program, not just a 9-month, 6-month, whatever time limitation. So seeking to expand it in that way. I know it was really brief. I'm trying to give as much time as I can, but are there any questions for me?
Hey, Jeff, if I wanted to bring a worker in and have them on my farm, let's say March 1st. I know you had your different deadlines there, but just from a practical standpoint, when should I really start the application process?
I mean, and I suggested 6 months before you want them, I guess. It's compiling all that information that you, and the flag website that I provided in the slides and on the resource page, they have tutorials, video tutorials, and a step-by-step guide for the questions you'll be asked, and especially the first two filings. And so you can go through and see what information you will need prior to filing. So you can get all that done, making sure in requesting housing inspections, or getting guidance on housing standards, make sure that your housing is in compliance with that. And then making sure you're up to date on any recent changes. If you're going to use the adverse effect wage rate, has there been any changes since you last looked, and stuff like that. So I would say a safe bet would probably be 6 months, with the understanding that those first 3-ish months are just to get yourself ready for the tight timeline of the H-2A certification process.
So it sounds like preparation ahead of time is the key.
Sure is. At least for me. I mean, that's what I would do.
Okay. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, so let's move on.